So look, what I think we want to try and do in this this part of the event is to try and think about the reasons why Labour lost the election. And what I want us to grapple with, and you're going to be discussing this too, it's not just down to me, it is not just the reasons why Labour lost, but how and whether that's connected to the very nature of the Labour Party as a political project. And I want to suggest that it was the very nature of the Labour Party that limited, curbed, undermined, and ultimately, I think, destroyed the Corbyn project. And that comes in a context in which I think the period in which Corbyn was Labour leader, inspiring millions of people, 4 years, I think you can think of as a huge experiment on a very old debate. And that old debate, which has been there on the left in Britain for over a century, is can you turn the Labour Party into a vehicle for socialist advance? And I want to again suggest that under quite favourable conditions, the most left-wing leader of the Labour Party, and since you can argue about, but since at least the 1930s, so in living memory, and a majority of the Labour Party membership being a supporter of that leadership, huge numbers of people joining. This was, and I want to, again, this is the point I want to, I guess, make, and perhaps we can talk about it, is to say if you can't change the Labour Party and make it an effective vehicle for socialism under those conditions, this isn't just an abstract debate, this was tested, and I think tested to destruction. And we had to be ruthless about drawing conclusions from that. So this is the kind of things I want to talk about. Firstly, of course, the whole question of why Labour lost isn't just a polite, interesting discussion. It's the subject of a fierce debate, reflected and animated through the Labour leadership election and the fallout. Now, one of the arguments you hear, and you certainly hear it very loudly and in the media and so on, is the kind of right-wing case about why Labour lost. It comes from the kind of, what could you call it, the Jess Phillips wing of the Labour Party. And their argument boils down to this, really. The reason Labour lost can be summed up in one word, or rather one person, Corbyn. Corbyn, too left-wing, for the sensible common sense of the British public. He's too extreme. He's too tainted. He's too soft on terrorists. He's too soft on anti-Semites. He's too soft on Brits. You've heard all of this, some version of this kind of argument. And often it's combined with an argument that says Labour only wins elections when it occupies the middle ground, the centre ground. This is the kind of argument you hear, and that's where Labour should go back to. That's the answer. And the bolder amongst them will even say, come on, it was Tony Blair. Yeah, I might love him or hate him, but Tony Blair won 3 elections. Corbyn lost 2. That's the argument, isn't it? Let's go back to where New Labour and Blair occupied. Now, I think this is a fairly easy argument to deal with on the condition you're prepared to face up to certain facts, which is often where some people just refuse to. So make 4 quick points. Firstly, was Corbyn too left-wing? The truth is, poll after poll after poll, and this has actually been true for years, says the vast majority of people in Britain support the redistribution of wealth, the renationalisation of privatised utilities like the railways and so on, are opposed to austerity and want to see it end. That is hugely popular, which is why Corbyn's critics on the Labour right, who hated Corbyn, didn't tend to mention that. They didn't really they tried to change the subject to other things because they know it's popular. That's the first thing. Secondly, was it Corbyn and the left-wing manifesto? Well, we have a kind of controlled science. I did an arts degree, but even I know enough about science. If you have an experiment where you can control for certain factors and isolate them, you have to pay attention to the results. And we had a controlled test here because there was another general election in 2017. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the same leader, Corbyn, and a very similar manifesto. What was the result? Very different. Labour's vote went up by 3.5 million in 2017, and it falls by 2.6 million in 2019. To me, that is a strong case to say it's not as simple as saying it's Corbyn or the manifesto. Something else changed. We have to think about what that might be. Third point, if you know your history, and some people like to deliberately forget it, but it's worth knowing, it's true that Tony Blair and New Labour won 3 elections, 1997, 2001, 2005. After 18 years of the Tories, they were broken. They were broken. But what happened to Labour's vote? Because people didn't just want rid of the Tories, they wanted a change of, they wanted something different than Tory policies. You didn't get that from Tony Blair. Huge disillusionment. So between 1997 and 2010, this great vote-winning success of New Labour in the centre ground lost 5 million votes, half them in the first Parliament. Right? So this is the great electoral winning machine, and so on. Last point I just want to make here is one of the things you don't hear the Labour right going on about, or Corbyn's critics, is about how wonderfully social democratic parties, Labour's sister parties in Europe, are doing, who adopt the same strategy as the Labour right. Tell you why they don't, because I can't find examples of this. Where parties have adopted the kind of politics of Jess Phillips or Tom Watson or the Labour right, they're doing disastrously. The once mighty Social Democratic Party in Germany got its worst ever electoral performance in 2017. In France, the Socialist Party, which could win the presidency in 2012, by 2017 got just over 6% of the vote and came fifth and is disintegrating, beaten by a more radical left candidate. And you don't even have to go back then. I don't know if anyone followed, just across the RSC, the Irish general election. The Irish Labour Party, which got its most ever MPs just after the economic crisis in 2011, 37 MPs, a record for the Irish Labour Party. What did it get at the last election? 6. Just one more MP than the far left, who have 5 MPs, including 3 of our own comrades. Complete collapse, because it's participated in neoliberal austerity and so on. So this argument simply doesn't stack up. Now, I think there's a more difficult argument, and I think it is having an influence on many people who liked Corbyn, and I'm going to call it a softer left argument. And it's the kind of argument that says, we want to preserve the best of Corbyn, the opposition to austerity, the opposition to neoliberalism, support for progressive change. But what we need is a candidate with less baggage, who'll be more popular in the media, more electable. There's a strange debate that happens in Labour, and you have to know how to decode it, that says, the manifesto was all over the place. It offered too much. What we need is a narrower offer. What they mean is we need to retreat on the anti-austerity programme. Not abandon it completely, but have less of it. Right? This is the kind of argument that's put. We need to be firmer, and all the candidates say this, don't we? We need to be firmer on dealing with this supposed crisis about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And we need to reach out and unite the Labour Party, the left and the right. That's the logic that takes you to Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer's been quite clever. I think he's a hard right-winger, and I think he will lead a big retreat in the Labour Party. But in truth, Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's the more left-wing, is also making retreats. Why does she write an article talking about progressive patriotism? Britain's an imperialist state that has oppressed countries on. You can't have a progressive patriotism, a contradiction in terms. Why does she write that article? Because writing that article says one thing: I'm not Jeremy Corbyn and it's internationalism and anti-imperialism. It's about retreating from these. So why does Rebecca Long-Bailey, who says we want to preserve Corbyn's legacy, why is she supporting Angela Rayner rather than the more left-wing Richard Bergen? Angela Rayner is not particularly left-wing. She's much closer to Keir Starmer. Again, because it's saying we have to reach out to the right in the Labour Party and unify it. What you're being offered, in other words, is a retreat from the high point of the radicalism of Corbynism. And it's just a question about the speed of that retreat. That's the difference between Starmer and Rebecca Long-Bailey, I think, if we're honest about it. Now, here's the point I want to argue. It's precisely the retreats from the high point of Corbynism that occurred under Corbyn's leadership that paved the way for the defeat in 2019. Now, not the only, but in some ways the most important example of this is Labour's policy on Brexit. Now, in raising this, I want people to put aside here their own attitude to the question of the EU and so on, and think about the impact it had of Labour's policy and how it changed on the election and how Labour was perceived. Because I think it's hard to deny that it had a huge and hugely damaging impact, because here was one of the big changes between 2017 and 2019. So if you want to just remind ourselves, in 2017, Labour's manifesto said, we accept the outcome of the referendum, but we want an anti-austerity progressive break from the European Union if that's what's now going to happen. We want a people's Brexit. That was Labour's position. 2 years on, 2019, Labour's position was to say if Labour's elected, it would hold a second referendum on membership of the European Union. And I think this is hard to argue with, that while some people supported that, millions of people saw it as firstly a denial of the democratic vote of 2016, whether you agree with it or not, but 17.4 million people voted to leave. It was saying, come on, keep voting until you get the right result. That's how people saw it. And I think it reinforced a notion that Corbyn had offered, Corbyn had offered something very different to British politics. He was a radical who wasn't a careerist, who wasn't a machine politician. He was offering a challenge to the establishment. But by switching Labour's position on Brexit, Boris Johnson, with some effect, I think, was able, mendaciously, and it's fake and false and so on, but able to say, Labour's just the same as all the other politicians, aren't they? They hold ordinary people in disregard, they ignore you, they hold you in contempt, they think you're... all these kind of arguments, which go quite deep. People are deeply cynical about politicians. In 2017, Corbyn could be an alternative to that. But I think the switch and the abandonment of honouring the Brexit vote allowed Boris Johnson, I mean, God knows this Etonian elitist, to paint Labour as part of the establishment. And it did damage. And here's one bit of evidence for that. Over the night of the 12th of December to the 23rd of December, the general election, 54 seats went from being held by Labour MPs to Tory MPs. In parliamentary terms, that's devastating, right? It's devastating. Of those 54, 52 of them are constituencies where the majority of people voted leave. In actual fact, I mean, some people did switch to the Tories. I'm not sure we should over-exaggerate this. The Tory vote in this election only went up by 300,000. Some people switched to the Tories because of the question of Brexit. Some people will have voted for the Brexit Party and split the vote and allowed a Tory in. I suspect that the biggest group of people, of the 2.6 million people who didn't vote Labour, were people who felt abandoned by Labour and didn't vote. In other words, they demoralise part of their own support. Where they had enthused people in 2017, they demoralised them. I want to stress, though, I don't think it's just Brexit. I think there have been a series of other retreats by Labour under Corbyn. The whole notion, as I mentioned, that Labour is somehow uniquely, compared to any other party, riddled with anti-Semitism. I think Labour's response again and again is defensive, apologetic, it looked weak, and it made concession after a new disciplinary code, more expulsions, the signing up to all the examples of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. None of it was ever enough. Because if you make concessions to a witch hunt, the witch hunt doesn't end, they keep coming for you. And you look guilty. And this did enormous damage to Labour. But I also think it's more general. Again, I think some of that earlier radicalism and anti-establishment feeling that could harness some of the bitterness in British society and channel it towards Labour and the left was much more diluted. You know, Labour could still offer in the last election, talking about redistribution of wealth and so on, ending low pay, 0 hours contracts, but it would also talk about we want to protect big business and promote big. We're not anti-business. It mutes that radicalism. And I think that's what allowed Labour to be defeated. Now, people may want to disagree and debate all of this, and that's what we're here to do. But I want to just press on a little bit and say, why? Why did these retreats happen? Especially given you had Corbyn and you had a majority of the Labour Party who supported Corbyn. Why did these retreats take? How could this have happened? What were the forces in the Labour Party who pressed for these retreats, and why did they have some power? And secondly, just because your enemy wants you to do something doesn't mean you do it. So why in the end did Corbyn make retreats that so damaged and undermined him? Okay, what were the forces pressing against Jeremy Corbyn? And I don't mean the media and so on, I mean inside the Labour Party. This is where the real damage was done. Now, the most obvious is the Labour right, particularly the Parliamentary Labour Party, where the Labour right had an overwhelming majority. People I would describe as the political children of Tony Blair, shaped by the New Labour era by and large. I think as a layer, far more than the ordinary member who's active in the Labour Party, the parliamentarians are much more shaped by the media, by bourgeois opinion. They're people who aspire to run the ship of the state, who buy into the whole idea of the national interest. What's good for the economy is good for the rest of us. They're predisposed to that kind of view. And yet, they're a minority in the party. And, you have MPs, some of whom are very vocal, Margaret Hodge, Tom Watson, Jess Phillips, all the kind of people I always used to turn the radio off when they came on, when attacking Corbyn yet again. But what were there, a few hundred of them, a couple of hundred in Parliament? How could they have such an impact? How can they have such an impact in a party of 500,000? And I think that part of this is the very nature of the Labour Party. That the Labour Party strategy for social change, for socialist change, is to get elected into Parliament and form a government. And that means that the MPs themselves become much more important than the ordinary rank and file members, whose ultimate job in the Labour Party is to go out on the knocker and get those people elected. It privileges, if you like, structurally, it privileges MPs. Secondly, those MPs do not want to be held account by the mass of membership. Who should decide what the MPs do? Who should decide what Labour government does? Not the members. They're very, very keen on saying this. If you know your Labour Party history, you'll know that in 1906, Labour made its first big breakthrough and got 29 MPs. Right? Within a year, 1907, a vote was taken to declare the Parliamentary Labour Party autonomous of the Labour Party itself. It's a separate institution that can take as guidance what happens at Labour conference, but isn't disciplined by it. In other words, it frees itself from democratic accountability to the mass of members. And when the mass of members say things like, well, we should be able to vote who our MP is, reselection, it's bullying, it's tyranny. It reflects a deeply anti-democratic attitude. And in practice, the 500,000 strong Labour membership struggles to hold to account its own leadership and its own representatives in Parliament. And that's built into the very nature of the Labour Party project. And the Labour MPs are the people who hammered away at the idea that Labour must adopt a second referendum. Actually, the key person pushing that, Keir Starmer. That's the truth about it. Now, a lot of people will agree with that. I think there's something else you've got to say. I think there's another big power centre in the Labour Party. And it's not as obvious the role it plays, but it's very, very important, which is the trade unions. Now, the trade unions are very, very important to the Labour Party. A huge amount of the funding, but it comes from the trade. It's not just that. At every level of the Labour Party, the trade unions are kind of stitched into its structures. I don't know if you know, the main leadership body that runs the Labour Party on a kind of day-to-day basis is called the National Executive Committee, the NEC. Sometimes people talk about this. It has 32 people on it, some elected by the membership and so on. 12 of those are elected by the trade unions. Half of the delegates at Labour's conference each year are elected by the unions. The unions play an incredibly important role. And you do hear people sometimes say, with justification, it was the trade unions that set up the Labour Party. And this is what makes Labour different. It's different to the Tories, it's different to the Liberals, it's different actually to the US Democrats. That the unions give a link between Labour and the working class, collectively. This is true. The difficulty is I think you can only accept that statement with a very, very significant qualification, which is that it wasn't so much the unions as such that set up the Labour Party, it was what I'm going to call the trade union bureaucracy that set up the Labour Party. In other words, if you think about a union like Unison, it's the biggest one in Britain, has about 1 million members. People who just go to work each day and pay subs, volunteer sometimes for the union and be reps and so on. But they also have a paid layer of officials who work full-time as employees, not just on release for their employer, like some, but are employed and recruited and supervised by the union itself. So in the case of Unison, it has about 5,000 people who work for it full-time. And those people have a vested interest in the continuation of that institution. If the membership halves, they can't pay their subs or their pensions. They have to protect that institution. And it's more than that. What's the job, fundamentally, of those trade union officials? When you're having a dispute with your employer about your wages and conditions, they are people who are, if you like, professional negotiators, professional mediators between labour and capital, between the contending classes of capitalist society. And they come to see their role as mediation and compromise. And locked in quite cautious institutions, these huge bodies with huge funding and so on and so forth, they become a very cautious layer. And they take that into the Labour Party, and they have a huge influence. So, one of the retreats that Labour made, quite early actually, under Corbyn, was the question of Trident. You know, Trident, it's Britain's nuclear arsenal. It's up for renewal at the cost of 100 billion, although like HS2, watch that go up, right, massively. Huge thing. Yeah, it's fine. Jeremy Corbyn is opposed to Trident and nuclear missiles. To his credit, he said he'd never press the button. But what's Labour's policy under Corbyn? To accept the renewal of Trident. Why? It's not really explained by the Labour right. It was the GMB trade union. OK, they're right-wingers. That's true, the leadership. But then Unite, which supports Corbyn, who said, you have to accept this policy. You have to accept this policy. Look at another retreat. Labour's position under Corbyn was to say that if Britain leaves the European Union, free movement for EU nationals will come to an end. Which, no matter how much you say we support all of humanity, we have to treat people with respect, implicitly implies the idea that immigration is a problem, that immigrants undermine wages. This is not true, by the way, but Jeremy Corbyn would also say these things. Why did Labour retreat on that? Because Len McCluskey of Unite thinks it's unpopular with his members. I'm sure he's right about this, by the way, but that's what he thinks. So you have to retreat on it. You have to retreat on it. So these are the huge institutional pressures that exist on Labour. You want me to sum up? How long? Yeah, fine. OK. Take another example. Cast your mind back to the summer of 2018. Labour was being told, if you want to prove you're not anti-Semitic, you have to sign up not just to the definition of anti-Semitism in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, but all the examples. Crucially, the one that says Israel is a racist endeavour. I don't know how you explain the oppression of the Palestinians without saying that Israel is a racist endeavour. And by the way, every Palestinian who has lived since 1948 thinks Israel is a racist endeavour. That has to be cast aside. What happened? What happened? The Labour right said you've got to sign up to it. The soft left, Emily Thornberry, Keir Starmer, you have to sign up to it. The right-wing trade unions sign up. The left-wing trade unions sign up to it. Corbyn ends up isolated, and Labour sign up to it. Doesn't end the witch hunt, of course, but it puts Labour on the defensive. And this is the same pattern that we see again and again. Why does Corbyn end up doing this? Why does he end up doing this? Because, and here's the most dangerous word. It's a word that we use a lot, and it's a word that's incredibly important, but it's a word that could get turned against Corbyn and the left. Unity. When we talk about unity, we talk about uniting the maximum number of people in struggle, trying to challenge anti-racism and saying, or challenge racism, challenge homophobia, uniting working class people, and also saying, when you're faced with a common enemy, the employers or the Tories or the state, of course we'll argue, but we'll also link arms, whatever our differences on the left. That's what we mean by unity. It's entirely progressive and right. Unity in the Labour Party means, again and again, it means don't take your argument with the Labour right too far. We have to hold the party together. Jeremy, as leader, you have to unite the left and the right. It creates these huge pressures. If Corbyn comes out for the Palestinians and said, of course we're against anti-Semitism and we'll deal with it in the Labour Party, but the real problem is on the far right, and actually the Tories are starting to echo some of these anti-Semitic arguments, and we unconditionally support the Palestinians. He can't even carry half of his shadow cabinet with him. That's the problem. And the pressure, therefore, to fudge and to compromise becomes huge. Why, fundamentally, it's not just a moral failing of Corbyn. No, that'd be too easy to explain it. It's the nature of the Labour Party itself, because the Labour Party, to get elected, you have to maximise votes. You want votes from left-wing people, but it also wants votes from people who are perhaps not so left-wing, not so clear. In other words, the Labour Party reflects the unevenness of ideas of working class people, advanced ideas, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and so on. But it also wants votes for people who want some change, but they also sometimes support Britain's wars abroad. They think there's too many immigrants, and it has to take the votes for both. And that becomes institutional and organised in the Labour Party. This is the famous phrase, a broad church. Labour has a left wing and it has a right wing. And they battle between each other, but they both share the same assumption. It's by getting elected and taking over the institutions of liberal democracy, forming a government. This is how you get change. And that creates constant process of compromise and paralysis whenever the left rises inside the Labour Party. And that fatally undermined the whole Corbyn project, forcing retreat after retreat, to the point where that radicalism that could harness the bitterness in British society and push it in a left-wing direction, which we saw in 2017, reached the point when Johnson could paint Labour as part of the same old establishment. A devastating result. Now, what's the alternative? And we're going to talk about this a bit more in the next session. What sometimes people say to us is, what's your alternative then? You know, sounds so clever. What's your alternative? Revolution tomorrow, I suppose. Well, I'm in favour of revolution tomorrow. Not going to be a revolution tomorrow in Britain. I'll tell you what the alternative is, though, is to take something that Karl Marx said very seriously. You know, in Communist Manifesto, Marx says workers have nothing to lose but their chains, right? So to the question, how will the working class be liberated? Who will liberate the working class? Is it you, Karl Marx? You know, is it some clever party and so on and so forth? No. Marx's argument was the working class itself would liberate the working class. He called it the self-emancipation of the working class. The act of the emancipation, liberation of the working class will be the act of the working class. And I think we have to take that very seriously, because if you look at that model of social change that the Labour Party has through elections, parliament and so on, what does it ask of us? What does it ask of the majority of workers? It asks them to vote Labour. Very occasionally, episodically, once every 4 or 5 years in terms of government. When you go to vote, it's atomised. You do so as an individual ballot, not collectively. You might go to a meeting, but when you vote, the act of voting is an atomised individual act. Secondly, it occurs in constituencies that have rich and poor in them. It's a geographical area. It's not workers here and employers there. It's mixed up. It masks those class divisions that take place in society. And that means that you have built into the system is actually you can vote for somebody. It's very difficult to exercise real control over your elected representatives. So you have the, if you like, the formal structures of democracy, but in practice, all the pressures and seducements and co-option of the system are much greater on your MP, and if they don't buckle, they can be smashed and broken, than the people who voted for them in. By contrast, when you see collective struggle, and especially where it's working class struggle in the workplace, I think it offers much, much greater potential. Firstly, because think about a strike. There'll be a strike in the universities. I think Birkbeck's one of them, actually. To be successful, it has to have mass participation. To be really successful, it can't just people go on strike and go home each day, but they're actively involved in the strike. That you have a strike committee, that you debate and organise, that you have mass pickets, you have demonstrations. And at certain high points of class struggle, you don't just walk out, you take over and occupy and start running the workplace, which, by the way, maybe you're not going to produce the same things the bosses want. You start to produce things for human need. And it allows you much greater participation, much greater democratic control over your own representatives, not voting once every 5 years. It can be daily decisions at high points of struggles. And it involves a power, because you can paralyse the economy far beyond what takes place in the economy. So here's a little example. In Labour's manifesto, it said it would end outsourcing, privatisation in the NHS. Quite right, quite right. It's not going to happen because Labour lost the election. In West London, at St Mary's Hospital, 200 workers, mainly migrants, went on strike for 9 days, very militant, very combative. They threatened all-out strike action. They won more sick pay, generally more pay. They've also won the end of outsourcing, not just for them, but across the whole hospital trust of 1,000 people. So what Labour couldn't achieve at the ballot box, 200 workers achieved at least, and it's an inspiration and an example. In other words, struggle can often win much more than working through the institutions of capitalist society. So our vision, and this is really what I just want to end, I think Labour's defeat is very serious. I think a huge number of people on the left, and I completely understand this, put their hopes in Corbyn, and God knows, he was so refreshing compared to what Labour's been. I think we have to reassess. I don't think we can just carry on doing the same thing. I think we have to have a reassessment and say we have to have a reorientation on collective struggle, of encouraging that, of arguing for unity, of building parties dedicated to struggle, revolutionary parties, because it's struggle that can win gains in the here and now. What happened at St Mary's is a reform, but it's won through struggles that offer, under certain conditions, and we're beginning to see a glimpse of this around the world, the prospect of a revolutionary transformation in society. Therefore, we need parties that are dedicated to building on a revolutionary tradition, orientated on encouraging worker struggles, and are utterly uncompromising about the most fundamental principles, rather than constantly fudging it to keep a right wing on board. And I think that's what we now need to engage in.